hip-hop beats. You know them, you love them. Whether it's the 90s catalog of hip-hop legends like De La Soul,
Stakes is high. You know them stakes is high when you talking about
Tribe Called Quest, or the Far Side, or more recent examples. I love old school hip-hop beats. And by old school, I mean the swung sort of hip-hop beats that sound like a Purdy shuffle sped up. And of course, in the post-Chris Dave, Robert Glasper experiment era, they've been making a comeback in live music, particularly one species of J Dilla beat. But ubiquitous though they are, I still notice, sometimes when I walk by a gig, drummers not quite capturing it. And I'm not talking about Chris Dave or Mark Kohlenberg level capture it. I'm talking about basic, doesn't raise an eyebrow capturing it. So today we're going to talk about the biggest mistakes jazz drummers, rock drummers, and drummers in general make trying to play hip hop beats. And then later on in the lesson, we'll delve into some of the cool embellishments you can do with them. Stay tuned. Dudes, you know this, I know this. There's a transcription for this lesson. You don't need to transcribe it yourself. Click the link below the player, get your transcription. Anyway, onward to the lesson. In our first segment, we're going to discuss the major things jazz drummers, rock drummers, and drummers in general get wrong with hip-hop beats, plus a few basic ways to embellish them. Drum Nate, over to you. So in this first segment, let's address 3 categories of things drummers get wrong with hip-hop beats. First, we'll do things that jazz drummers tend to get wrong. Next, we'll do things that rock drummers get wrong. And finally, we'll do things that everybody kind of gets wrong. So when I hear jazz drummers who don't play backbeats traditionally playing hip hop, what's usually wrong is the voicing. Let me play just a basic beat with no embellishments, and we'll talk about what I'm doing with voicings. So one thing jazz drummers who don't play backbeats get wrong quite frequently when I hear them play hip hop is they don't play the kick drum loudly enough. The kick drum's kind of too light. So for hip hop, you really want to plant the beater into the head. And that's especially important if you're playing like an 18-inch drum that's tuned open like you might with jazz. The next thing is a lot of people play the hats unnecessarily loud. So you get this weird sort of top-down kind of. And what you want is to bring up the level of the kick drum and bring up the level of the snare drum in that mix and lower the level of the hats. And once you have that muscle memory, you can play with it. So that's the primary mistake I see from jazz drummers. The primary mistake I see from rock drummers who haven't played a lot of hip hop is the consistency of the 8th notes. So 8th notes can be extremely straight, like the E end of 4, E end of. Or they can be any degree swung between pretty wide triplet to really narrow dotted 8/16. All the way up to. And there are different styles for different hip hop beats, but a good rule of thumb if you're starting out is that your swung beats should equal more or less the first and last beat of a triplet. So it's as if you were playing triplet, triplet. And in fact, if you listen to drummers like Bernard Purdy and Jeff Porcaro play these shuffles, they'll often leave those ghost notes in. And the key, especially when you're starting out, is you want to make those 8s consistent. You don't want a beat that starts out straight and then gets more swung and then gets less swung again. And in rock, beats are looser and they sound great when they're looser. But for hip hop, you should work on that consistent swing. Finally, the thing all drummers struggle with when it comes to hip-hop beats is the lockup between the kick drum and the right hand. What do I mean? I mean this. Instead of, which sounds nasty, we're going to talk about that next. But you want to be able to play Got it? So now let's talk about one common hip hop beat I like and a cool embellishment you can do. A great archetype for the, I would say, average hip hop beat is Lupe Fiasco's song, I Gotcha. In fact, let's just roll a little bit of that.
You want the flavor, ma? Hey, I got you. You want the realness? Well, I know you're sick of them niggas that come and watch you. Either they pimps or they hacks or they mobsters.
So starting with the basic beat like this. 3, 4. Then it's adding a pickup to the snare note like this. 3, 4. Finally, it's adding a snare pickup on the last eighth of the bar to the kick beat on the downbeat. So the complete thing sounds like this. 3, 4. Now let's talk about one embellishment from Chris Dave, which is a tom embellishment, which is just 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. And for this, we're going to move the right hand over to the tambourine so that we have an unobstructed path between snare drum and high tom. So this beat sounds like this. 2, 3. By the way, if you're sweating the details, don't worry. As usual, this will be transcribed for you. Let me add one more embellishment in the right hand. 2, 3. And that's your basic hip hop crash course. Okay, so that's your basic swung eighth hip hop beat, but what about the ubiquitous Dilla beats? Let's talk about them. Okay, now let's talk about the Dilla beats, or really we mean the Chris Dave species of Dilla beats, because Dilla made a bunch of different beats, and it's really one primary one that Chris and his generation made the language of the next 15 years. But it rests on a beat that's halfway between straight and swung. Not exactly halfway, it's kind of felt. And there are people who say it's like a quintuplet swing instead of a triplet, so instead of... It's like... To me, that's a little too literal, and I don't think it really captures what Dilla was doing, which was allowing artifacts and imperfections into the beat. I think part of the thing that makes the Chris Dave species of Dilla beats ineffable is the fact that it's too human to be perfectly captured by a simple algorithm. It might be like 72% swing, but I don't think it's like a 4 out of 5, if you get my drift. Anyway, we're going to feel a hat beat that's not completely... And it's also not completely, it's going to be humanistically in between those two. So 3, 4. There's your basic beat. I'm going to link to Arthur L.A. Buckner's video on this where he gets into it. But same thing as in the earlier segment, we want to make sure that the hats are a little bit low in the mix compared to the kick and snare. I'll show you 2 ways things get funky. The first is when you start adding kick drum embellishments. And there are 2 ways to do that. You can do it with the hi-hat swing or against the hi-hat swing. So like the hi-hat swing is halfway swung and the kick drum is quantized completely straight. So with the hi-hat swing would be something like 2, 3. Which sounds super funky. It sounds like a Tom Misch beat. You can also do the kind of Perrin Moss loose feel where it's... where you're intentionally separating them so it sounds like kind of a quantization artifact. And the last thing I'll show you is the hi-hat embellishment, which sounds like this. 3. There are a few different ways to stick this. I'm told Chris sticks it right, left, right, right, left, right. I actually like to stick it right, right, left, right, right, left. And you're doing this thing where you're not permanently holding your left hand out over the hats. You're flipping your wrist underneath your right stick to go from snare to hats. So, right, instead of, it's a lot more arm movement there. You can also just stick the whole thing with the right hand. Recording example I'll point you to if you can find it is the Chris Dave Part 2 medley, even though I think that was copyright struck and the audio got taken away. It might exist on a non-YouTube site. I would just Google Chris Dave medley Part 2, but he plays that beat famously along with the Tribe song. And that's the basic gist with Dilla beats. Okay, and for you guys who have stuck around, let's talk about the ways drummers like Chris Dave, Spanky, JD Beck, and others embellish these. So now let's talk fancy stuff. The first thing I like to do is get comfortable with offset quarter note triplets. What's a regular quarter note triplet sound like over this beat? It sounds like... So an offset quarter note triplet would sound like this. 3, 4. For the first exercise, I want to just switch back and forth between the standard hip hop beat and that. 3, 4. Next, you could take your kick drum foot and play it along with the right hand here. 3, 4. Now what's really cool is when you play skip notes at the pulse of that offset quarter note triplet. So instead of, it would sound like, in context, instead of, it would sound like, so let's look at a couple ways we can embellish with this. Starting with this. 2, 3. Finally, you can move the right hand to the snare to orchestrate things kind of like Spanky or JD Beck would. That's how you get the gig. So dudes, hope you enjoyed this lesson. And as usual, if you want to get the transcription, you don't need to transcribe it yourself. Just click the link below the player and you can download it free and clear. 2 species of that. The free gift species where you get my free 3-video mini course, which will make your playing better in the next 3 weeks than it's gotten in the previous 6 months. It includes a lot of coordination stuff that'll help your hip hop. Click the big obvious red button on the next page. Or those of you who don't want to help your drumming for some reason, just click the boring, almost hidden link. In any event, really enjoyed this one. See you again next week in another lesson of the week.